Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. As I mentioned, I'm Chris, an executive committee member at Team Global, and I've been hosting these webinars for the past year or so. So thank you very much to Nadia and Emilie from Human Rights Watch for joining us this evening. It's much appreciated. The webinar will be going on for about an hour, and so we'll get stuck right into it. So a bit of background on Team Global first. So we were founded in 1958 as the European Atlantic Movement, an independent and apolitical educational foundation. So Team aims to enable young people to act as global citizens and to aspire to leadership roles within their communities. So we empower them to consider world issues and to take their part in resolving problems and promoting solutions. We work alongside students through our student-led initiative, The International Perspective, in which a team of students help their peers and wider society to become more aware of international issues. Through webinars such as these, we are engaging with students across the UK to think globally on a range of issues ranging from cybersecurity, global inequality, and in the case of this webinar, the ongoing human rights violations in the Ukraine. So a bit of background on Human Rights Watch. So the organisation investigates and reports on abuses happening in all corners of the world. They are a team of roughly 510 people doing research in 100 countries, ranging from 70 plus nationalities, all of whom are country experts, lawyers, journalists, and others who work to protect those most at risk, and from vulnerable minorities and civilians in wartime to refugees and children in need. So the HRW directs their advocacy towards governments, armed groups, and businesses, pushing them to change or enforce their laws, policies, and practices. To ensure their independence, they refuse government funding and carefully review all donations to ensure that they are consistent with their policies, mission, and values. They partner with organizations, large and small, across the globe to protect embattled activists and to help hold abusers to account and bring justice to victims. So thankfully, we're joined by Emilie and Nadia. So thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. So Emilie is a human rights and refugee advocate and professional with practical and academic experience and expertise in human rights, refugee, and international law more broadly. Prior to joining HRW, Emilie completed her doctorate in law at the University of Oxford on protecting the right to leave of asylum seekers, refugees, and other migrants during externalized migration control on a Rhodes Scholarship. She has experience working with a wide range of experts, actors, and people at risk, including the Department of Legal Affairs at the UNRWA in East Jerusalem, a UK legal aid firm in the Immigration, Detention and Deportation Team, the Oxford Human Rights Hub, and a legislative research officer in Australia. Emilie has a long-standing commitment to advancing the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, leading to her to co-found the Tasmanian Refugee Legal Service in 2013, the first of its kind in Tasmania, which she was a director of until 2016. She's also a qualified Australian lawyer, so plenty that Emilie's been doing to keep herself busy. So thank you very much, Emilie, for joining us. Nadia Hardman is a researcher in the Refugee and Migrant Rights Division of HRW, monitoring and documenting human rights abuses against asylum seekers, refugees, and migrant populations in the MENA and Asia region. Prior to joining HRW, she led the International Rescue Committee's protection program for Syrian refugees in Lebanon and was based in Mosul, Iraq, with the Norwegian Refugee Council, working with internally displaced persons between 2017 and 18. Nadia has worked with refugee and IDP populations in Myanmar, Thailand, and Palestine, and was a program lawyer for the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, working on law of issues in Azerbaijan, Cambodia, Egypt, and Tajikistan from 2013 to 15. She's also a qualified UK lawyer with a master's in human rights from the University College London, and also fluently speaks French and Italian. So fair to say, I think we've got the best two people, at least in the UK, if not the world, to speak on these issues. So thank you very much to Nadia and Emilie for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting us here today. Thanks, Chris, for that intro. So I am Nadia, and I'm going to start and kick off this presentation, which we'll be honest, we'll focus a lot on the refugee response to the Ukraine crisis. I will give an opening and then we'll hand over to Emilie and we'll have a bit of back and forth. I think the most interesting bits will hopefully be in the Q&A. So we really want to keep our bits short. And I'll also add at the end what I am doing in terms of ongoing research of human rights abuses against migrants inside Ukraine. So really the intro I'm gonna give you is maybe stats and numbers that you may already know, but we just wanted to set in context the situation of refugees in the context of the Ukraine crisis, because UNHCR, as of June 2022, says that this is the largest human displacement crisis in the world today, to date, and 1/3 of Ukrainians have been forced from their homes. Over 7.1 million people remain displaced by the war within Ukraine, and 15.7 million people are estimated to urgently require humanitarian assistance and protection. As of today, or a couple of weeks ago when this last update was issued, UNHCR estimates that there are over 4.7 million refugees present across Europe. And more than 6.9 million refugee movements have been recorded out of Ukraine. At the same time, and I think this is quite a significant factor of this refugee crisis, is that the authorities have reported more than 2 million movements back into the country. Over 2.9 million refugees from Ukraine have registered for temporary protection or similar national protection schemes inside Europe. I think what is probably most interesting, and I use that word lightly from sort of my perspective as a refugee and migrant rights researcher, is the European response to this refugee crisis, and the fact that the EU triggered for the first time the Temporary Protection Directive. Again, forgive me if you all know about the Temporary Protection Directive, but I'm just going to give you information in case you don't. So this directive was, this piece of law, European law, was adopted in the aftermath of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, when for the first time since the Second World War, Europe was confronted with mass displacement of people across Europe. And it was conceived as a way to avoid burdening asylum systems and managing the flows, a massive influx of displaced people flowing across Europe, and a way to avoid, again, the individual refugee status determination systems becoming overwhelmed. And it was decided in the context of Ukraine that this would be a controlled and effective way to give people access to fundamental rights and implement international obligations quickly and effectively. And it's, pretty exceptional that this is the first time since the early 2000s, when this Temporary Protection Directive was introduced, that it has been triggered. So it wasn't triggered in the Syrian refugee displacement, refugee crisis. What the temporary protection does is give people immediate protection. And that means tangibly access to residency, access to the labor market, access to housing, access to social welfare assistance, medical and otherwise. And, kids have the right to legal guardianship and access to education, which is incredible. It's amazing because people were given access to these rights and services really from day one. And when I and Emilie and others were monitoring, border movements when the Ukraine crisis and the conflict, the Russian invasion happened, what was most outstanding for me was just how much information was available very quickly. I do a lot of monitoring and documenting of refugee responses in other contexts in other countries. And one of the things that is, unavailable usually is, where can people go? What can they expect? You had leaflets distributed across neighboring countries, really quite immediately, reception centers for refugees, explanations of where to go, how to get access to, documentation to move freely throughout Europe and settle in the country that they wanted to. And this is really an example of enhance solidarity and responsibility sharing that, you know, we continue to promote as a kind of advocacy aim in lots of refugee contexts, but where we really have seen materialized in the refugee response. I think I'll stop there, but, you know, obviously this is the kind of grand, you know, opening and all the things that, you know, are good, but we will highlight some of the lesser or discriminatory aspects of the response. I'm going to pass over to Emilie now.
Thanks so much, Nadia. And yeah, thank you so much, Team Global, for having us both and hosting the seminar. So just to add that I'm part of the UK advocacy team. So I'm the UK advocacy and communications coordinator. So I'll be focusing a lot more on the UK's response to Ukraine and specifically our advocacy work with regards to the UK government. So one part of our work as advocates in response to the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's invasion has been to press governments to ensure not only that people fleeing Ukraine find protection in neighbouring countries, but also that they have safe passage out of Ukraine and into countries like the UK. So I'm sure that everyone is aware, but in early March, the UK was very swift to respond to the invasion in terms of how it was receiving refugees from Ukraine. So firstly, it launched the Ukraine Family Scheme. And again, apologies if people already know what these are, but I'll just give a little quick summary of them. So the Ukraine Family Scheme allows Ukrainians who are immediate and extended family members of a person who is based in the UK to join them in the UK, setting up a safe route for them to travel here. So applicants can live, work and study in the UK for up to 3 years, as well as access public funds. Later in March, only a week or so later, the government launched the Ukraine Sponsorship Scheme, which is commonly known in the UK as the Homes for Ukraine scheme. So that allows people to sponsor and citizens in the UK to sponsor Ukrainians, individual Ukrainians and families to come to the UK and stay with them for 6 months. And then they have the right to live and work and access funds in the UK for 3 years. And just to add, the UK obviously has also responded with a significant amount of humanitarian assistance. So this has included £220 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and neighbouring countries, 25 million to UNHCR, and then 20 million for Poland. And in terms of our advocacy at Human Rights Watch with the UK, at the very beginning of the conflict, we urged the UK government to provide sanctuary and a safe route for Ukrainians, or those fleeing Ukraine more broadly, to be able to come to the UK by temporarily waiving visa requirements. So although these schemes that I've just mentioned provide safe routes and there are concessions to the normal visa rules, so for example, you don't need to attend a visa centre in a neighbouring country if you have a passport, and you can get your fingerprints and that kind of thing done when you arrive, visa requirements are still in place. And you may have seen in the news, you know, repeatedly the past couple of months about just how difficult these bureaucratic and procedural hurdles have been for Ukrainians attempting to use these schemes and attempting to flee. So there have been very long delays, people unable to check the status of their application, so not even knowing if their visa has been granted. And I think the really interesting part about the UK not waiving visa requirements and why this is a broader issue is that conflicts like Ukraine and crises more generally show how visas and travel requirements, for example, carriers or airlines or ferries, are penalised if they transport someone who is undocumented. So this prevents many asylum seekers and many individuals from Ukraine simply boarding a plane to be able to get here. They need that visa to be able to travel safely. And this really stands in contrast to what Nadia has just mentioned, which is the EU triggering the Temporary Protection Directive, which does not have, you know, the EU had already removed visa requirements for Ukrainians, but really removing all procedural obstacles. And Ireland as well immediately lifted visa requirements for Ukrainians. So our advocacy with and to the UK to date is that the UK should have mirrored these responses and should have been waiving visa requirements, because it is really still leaving a lot of people in limbo, unable to access safety. And just to flag before I pass back over to Nadia, a couple of other advocacy points that we've been focusing on is ensuring that, especially within the Home for Ukraine program, it has very robust and ongoing safeguarding systems in place to ensure that vulnerable refugees, including women and children, are not subject to abuse or exploitation or violence when they're taken in under this Home for Ukrainian scheme, as well as ensuring they don't end up homeless or without a place to stay when they do arrive or after a couple of months. And additionally, also considering how the UK can support non-Ukrainian nationals who are trying to flee Ukraine or who have fled Ukraine by providing visas, but also supporting students to continue their studies in the UK. And I'll pass back over to Nadia because I think that links very well to what she might discuss on discrimination towards non-Ukrainian nationals.
Thanks so much, Emily. Thank you. So yes, basically obviously Human Rights Watch is here to document human rights abuses. And, my job as a researcher in the Refugee and Migrant Rights Division is to investigate and expose abuses. And in the context of the Ukraine refugee crisis, really the abuses that we documented were in relation to non-Ukrainian refugees. And that is what we've focused on, because honestly, the response generally to Ukrainian refugees, at least in European countries, after triggering the Temporary Protection Directive, was pretty exemplary. We had some concerns, for example, in Poland, of some of the organizational ways in which the receiving bodies at the border were managing the process. It was basically a bit disorganized. But you honestly had neighboring countries opening their borders and arms wide and giving, as I said previously, people access to fundamental rights very quickly. In the context of non-Ukrainian nationals, I don't know if you remember in the early days of the invasion, when we were seeing these mass numbers of people fleeing across the border, there were also reports of non-Ukrainians and honestly Black and brown people being delayed not even being delayed, being stopped, forced to wait before boarding buses, boarding trains, and being forced to wait in near freezing or freezing conditions at the border, predominantly with Poland. So what we did, and what we've done generally in this crisis, is deploy Human Rights Watch staff on the ground in Ukraine and on the other side in Poland, in Moldova, and in Hungary also. But we documented really quite distressing cases of Black and brown, predominantly non-Ukrainian refugees. And a lot of them were students trying to leave and being held back and told that they would have to wait while Ukrainians were allowed to cross. To Ukraine's credit, it reacted quite swiftly and set up a hotline quite early on in the response, and directed border officials. What we saw were border officials on both sides, so both on the Ukrainian side and on the refugee host nation, holding people back and or detaining them. And I can talk about detentions in a moment. But there was a Ukraine border official. These were Ukrainian border officials that were holding people back, and also train officials holding people back and not allowing them to access the border in the same way as Ukrainian refugees. But as I said, to Ukraine's credit, quite quickly a hotline was set up and a policy in practice to stop that kind of discriminatory treatment. but it was incredibly distressing to see it, especially in the visual image of the fact that, you know, people that were held back were, you know, basically non-white. What I also focused on in those early days is the detention of non-Ukrainian refugees who crossed the border, but then were detained in Poland. So I was in touch with a number of Ethiopian nationals, I'm still in touch with a few of them, who crossed the border in the very early days before the Temporary Protection Directive kicked in. And then, so there was this kind of gap. And in that time, a number of people were, you know, permitted to cross, but then immediately detained and taken to a detention facility in Poland where, you know, some still languish. And this, you know, the Polish immigration system is a whole other seminar in itself, that is incredibly difficult to access, and you know, getting people lawyers, getting people effective translators is what we've been trying to do. But some of those people are still in detention now. And of course, you didn't see this in the context of Ukrainian refugees. I'll then go on in a later, my final kind of look at other research I've been doing in Ukraine about other migrants that were previously in detention in Ukraine and what happened to them. But I wanted to also draw out and highlight one of the difficulties that, you know, my division, Emilie's division, or just generally at Human Rights Watch, how we have struggled to, you know, put this Ukraine wonderful response that we've seen in Europe and this solidarity and responsibility and burden sharing, and juxtapose that with the very different response to Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees, Ethiopian refugees, etc. And it is something that we have seen also highlighted, for example, in Denmark, where, you know, you have a government that pursues a zero asylum policy and a very hardline policy against asylum seekers and refugees, dropping some of the most nefarious of those policies and practices in the context of Ukrainian refugees. You know, and to give you an example, Denmark has a so-called jewelry law that allows Denmark's immigration officials to seize the assets of asylum seekers in order to potentially pay for their stay in the country. It's quite a national, it's nicknamed the jewelry law. And, you know, ministers lobbied and were successful in basically removing that law in the context of Ukrainian refugees who ended up in Denmark. And that kind of differential treatment is, you know, extremely difficult then for me to explain to a Syrian refugee why, it is incredibly, why that kind of treatment is okay for them, but not okay for a Ukrainian refugee. And there simply is no rational or objective basis upon which to do that. I'm just reading the comment. Is it a valid criticism the disproportionate level of publicity and effort that's given to the Ukrainian refugee crisis has not been given to earlier crises? Look, I don't know. I mean, that's a really tricky question. I mean, I think what for me is disproportionate is the response, right? So, you know, is to see such a wonderful, I mean, maybe I guess the question is it because of that then that you have such meaningful protection? I mean, I have my own personal opinion why there's, you know, such meaningful protection as opposed to other nationalities. But I think it is not fair is the point. We need to extend the solidarity to other humanitarian crises and other refugees of other nationalities. And definitely, you know, we at Human Rights Watch and definitely in the work I've done are highlighting the fact that a lot of the discriminatory treatment has been against non-Christian Black and brown refugees. And we've seen it really in the context of Ukraine come to fruition. Okay, I will maybe stop there. So I would just say that in the early days, that was the work that we were doing. And just one final point. We also have documented quite recently how Roma refugees from Ukraine have, for example, been treated in a discriminatory manner in Moldova. So Roma refugees who fled Ukraine at the same time as Ukrainian refugees found themselves being housed in separate buildings to Ukrainian refugees. So I'll round off by saying that a lot of our work has really focused on treatment of non-Ukrainians because, we are here to document abuses. We are here to shine a light and expose those situations where abuse is taking place. And that is where we have seen it manifest. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nadia. I can jump in on how this has played out in the UK, and I imagine a lot of people have also seen this directly. So the UK, like a lot of other governments, exactly what Nadia said, have been showing immense compassion, very swiftly responding to the conflict and providing sanctuary to Ukrainian refugees. People have literally opened up their homes and their hearts to Ukrainians in a way we have never seen before, I don't think. However, this really stands in stark contrast to how the UK government responds to refugees coming from the Middle East, from Africa, who are very much forced to take dangerous and desperate journeys, such as getting on a small dinghy and crossing the English Channel. So I'm thinking of Syrians, Afghans fleeing since the Taliban takeover, Eritreans fleeing conscription. And in contrast to Ukrainians, where we have, there are problems with the schemes, as I mentioned, but the schemes are there and they are functioning. For others, Syrians, Afghans, there are little to no safe routes for them to come to the UK through safe means. So if we just, if we compare the response to Ukrainians, say to Afghans, so in just over a month, the UK established and operationalized 2 schemes for Ukrainian refugees and their families. More than, I think, 10 months ago now, since the Taliban takeover, the UK did set up 2 schemes for Afghans. So we've got the Afghan relocation scheme, which is for individuals who worked with and for the UK mission in Afghanistan. And then we have the ACRS, which is the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, which with the UK government pledging to resettle 20,000 Afghan refugees. And 10 months on, they're still not properly functioning or operationalized. And that compares to the thousands of Ukrainians who've been able to travel to the UK. And by way of stark contrast as well, there is no equivalent family reunion scheme for Afghans or a sponsorship scheme. And indeed, in the UK, there are thousands of Afghans who have been evacuated from Afghanistan who are stuck living in hotels in very deplorable conditions, as my colleagues and Nadia's colleagues from Human Rights Watch have documented, our Afghan researchers. And so I think what we can see is that the government and other governments have really shown how fast they can act if they want to be able to provide safe passage to people, provide protection. And from where we're sitting, this is a clear double standard. And as Nadia mentioned, this is very much along racial lines and how we view refugees who are white compared to refugees who are of color. And I think just a couple of things to note before I hand over to Nadia, probably for our concluding comments, is that the UK has a greater moral responsibility towards Afghans because many of the individuals worked with us in Afghanistan and they're now at risk because of that work that they did with the UK and their family members. We're in touch with a number of organizations who work with individuals who've been evacuated whose family members face direct threats from the Taliban and are directly targeted because they know their family member worked with the British and is now in the UK. And the situation in Afghanistan continues to deteriorate, especially for women and for girls. We've got a new report that just came out today, which shows the Taliban torturing civilians. So the situation in Afghanistan hasn't gone away, yet the response is, there are still huge processing delays. The numbers in comparison to Ukraine are so significantly lower. It's not a functioning system. So, really desperately needing a safe operational route to the UK to reunify with their family, for Syrians, for Afghans, to others other than Ukraine's. And just to quickly comment on the first question in the chat, and I think we could, we can move eventually to some of the questions, but I think that it has been disproportionate. And the point is, it's not that they shouldn't be reacting like this to Ukrainians. They should be reacting swiftly with very robust measures, welcoming compassion. But the point is that the response, this should be the same response to every humanitarian crisis. And that is why, maybe we can get into the discussion. One of the critiques is that, well, the UK, the EU, they can't take everyone. And that's, that is the case. However, we take far less than other countries. And if all countries are pulling their fair weight and actually sharing responsibility for refugees rather than just leaving them to languish in Poland, then the system will function in a much better way. Nadia, shall I pass over to you for your concluding remarks?
Thanks, Emilie. I also realized I didn't, in my little brief section, talk about the main bit of work that I've been doing in the context of Ukraine. So I was so sort of focused on, discrimination in Europe. But I will mention before I just conclude that what I have actually been doing is monitoring and documenting and investigating how migrants and asylum seekers that were in detention in Ukraine before the war started are still in detention. And, we're talking about people who were detained arbitrarily, we would say, because, immigration detention has to be a measure of last resort. And, there are certain standards, and, we very confidently feel in this case that none of those standards were met. But, people who had visa irregularities or had tried to cross the border into Poland, again, this is all pre-war, had been detained for months and months and months. I mean, some people for up to 18 months in detention facilities, were not allowed to flee. So we're basically still being kept in migrant detention during the war. And so I've put out 2 reports on this issue since the Russian invasion. And I can go into a little bit more detail about the detention facilities, because there are some quite particular and important aspects to it, but there are some security concerns about describing those detention facilities. But one of the detention facilities is on the front line. Is really in an area that is under heavy attack near heavy attack in Ukraine, and that's Mykolaiv. And we have been sounding the alarm, as have other organizations, and we've interviewed people inside these detention facilities. And again, it's a lot of Black and brown people, people from Afghanistan, Syria, Ethiopia, Palestine, Ghana, Algeria. And, some have been released with the intervention of their embassies as well. Some remain in detention. We also worked with an organization to get an emergency request at the European Union to basically, get people out. And we were partially successful. They've been ordered to move these people. But that's basically what I've spent a lot of time. Most of my efforts on Ukraine has been focused on that bit of work. And I should have included that in my second presentation to you. But I guess, in conclusion, really, I think what we, in my division are grappling with is how to harness the solidarity, and the compassion, as Emilie said, that we've seen displayed in, Europe's response to Ukraine, and how to harness that and replicate it and make sure and try and push for a similar response in other humanitarian situations. People are, you don't hear about Iraqi refugees anymore, right? It's people get really fatigued by humanitarian responses. Yemen is not talked about. Afghanistan had its time in the limelight. Myanmar, and people still, are fleeing persecution and conflict in these places and need and deserve asylum. Yet they just don't make the media and limelight. So we're open to suggestions from you as well as to how to push for the kind of for the replication of these this welcoming and compassionate approach in other contexts. But we are also impressed and incredibly, I mean, I'm humbled also by Europe's welcoming response. It is incredible to see. And so everything that we've said should not take away from that, because it is, you know, exemplary, and there are, you know, war crimes being committed, which you know, our colleagues are documenting on a constant basis inside Ukraine. And it is incredible that Europe is responding and allowing people to flee a very dangerous place. I'm just reading the comments before I hand over to Emilie. The probability of a Ukrainian ending up being sent to Rwanda is, let's face it, highly improbable. Other ethnicities. Yeah, I mean, this, I think, very swiftly move on to Emilie, who's working a lot on the UK-Rwanda deal. Over to you, Emilie.
Thanks, Nadia. And yeah, we can certainly chat in the Q&A about Rwanda further. I'll just give some concluding remarks, which do indeed touch on Rwanda. I really just have two probably overarching concluding points, and one of them very much relates to what Nadia has said, which is very much thinking about how in the UK and beyond do we utilize and mobilize and galvanize the compassion and the quick responses that we have seen in responding to people fleeing Ukraine, and extend that to all individuals fleeing. And how do we use that to influence and shape migration and asylum policies that are more human rights and refugee rights compliant? And second, I think my other concluding comment is really just to situate the Ukraine response in the broader UK context of what's happening to the UK asylum system at the moment. So at the very same time that the UK was you know, responding to Ukraine and taking these very robust measures, it was passing a new law which seeks to dismantle the whole refugee protection regime in the UK. It's called the Nationality and Borders Act. And this was passed into law. It allows pushbacks of people in the English Channel, offshore detention, criminalising with a penalty of up to 4 years in prison for seeking asylum irregularly, and a whole host of other very very bad provisions that, you know, all collated into this one act. And then now, as someone has rightfully commented in the chat, we have the Rwanda deal. So the UK government, in case people aren't aware, recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the Rwandan government to send an uncapped number of asylum seekers to Rwanda, where they will be processed under Rwanda's asylum system. If they are found to be a refugee, they will be granted refugee status there, and they will stay in Rwanda, not to return to the UK. So it is a one-way ticket. And, you know, coming back to the groups that are discriminated against and treated differently, Syrians, Afghans, Eritreans, Sudanese, they're all the highest numbers who are on the first, you know, deportation list to Rwanda for next week. And, you know, something we can discuss is how this is really part of a systematic trend, a racist systematic trend that shapes migration regimes and shapes who can seek asylum in the UK. So I'll leave it there, and thank you so much all for listening and attending, and really looking forward to the discussion and delving into some of the great questions that you've posed.
Thank you, Emilie. Thank you, Nadia. I'm sure everyone will agree it's been truly fascinating. So we'll close this part of the briefing.